Hey guys, good evening. I'm back with another entry of Raimes Mailbag where I go and answer questions that you guys ask me in the comments section at length. So today it's going to be sort of I feel like, I shouldn't really have to answer either one of these, but for some reason people seem to ask me these questions quite often. We're just going to be covering two questions today. And that is, am I pro-trans and pro-LGBT? Well, I mean, I'm queer. I'm trans. This really, in all honesty, should be self-explanatory, but I'll go ahead and explain it at length because some people seem to be confused after they're reading a couple of my old tweets and stuff. I am obviously pro-trans, being trans myself. I am obviously pro-LGBT, being queer myself, but I don't really think I like where the movement is heading, more or less. So growing up in the post-AIDS era, we were kind of fresh out of the AIDS epidemic and stuff. It was kind of a weird era to be growing up in. If you were trans, you were still listed as a sexual deviancy in the DSM manual that mental health professionals would use. If you would run around saying, hey, I'm, whoever that believes I'm whatever, a lot of the time they would literally try to have you institutionalized over it. So this was kind of the era that I was growing up in for a while. In the grand scheme of things, I feel that the term transgender is a relatively new phenomenon. So I don't really care where the movement has been going for a while now. Maybe it's just me kind of being old, per se, but when I was growing up, if you were trans, you pretty much saw the worst of it and stuff. You had to fight off people in school, you weren't really safe at home. There just really wasn't jack shit for you. If you went to the police about anything, like any sort of assault or anything like that, the cops literally would do nothing. They wouldn't really see anything wrong with it, per se. And so I find it kind of interesting where the movement has been going these days. Growing up as an older trans woman, I think I had made it out of childhood just being incredibly grateful that I had survived. Surviving conversion therapy and everything else, I was just incredibly grateful, although heavily scarred. And it was just one of those things I think that I just kind of had to learn to live with. Like when I was growing up, there was multiple drugs that they would give you to try to treat it because a lot of people at the time believed that it was rooted in psychosis, and then, is listed as sexual deviancy. And then if you grew up in a religious household, they believed that bringing you closer to whatever God they believed in would fix it. And it was kind of like the transgender version of pray the gay away. And so I'm not going to bother to get into conversion therapy and all that. The experience was awful and it had damn near killed me, and quite frankly, I really just don't want to relive that. What I would like to talk about is how the movement has actually changed over the years and stuff. So, those in my age bracket were just happy to survive and to go on living and to kind of make it out of the dark ages and stuff. We got to live long enough to go and see the end of it being listed as a sexual deviancy disorder. That's speech impediment, though. Listed in the DSM, and, then it was moved over to being a dysphoric disorder. And so I look at, the current movement, and I don't really care for what it has become too much. When I was a lot younger and such, we had a lot of people that had boots on the ground. They were kind of fighting tooth and nail for the basic right to just exist and stuff, and the movement nowadays is more focused on people complaining that they've been misgendered or things like that. I don't really care for a lot of the things that are being chased these days. Like, when I was growing up, it was straight hell getting hormones. It was straight hell even getting the ability to go and admit that you're trans without some sort of substantial backlash attached to it. Nothing was ever really done. If you went to conversion therapy, back then it wasn't considered a public health issue. It was considered just something that was a personal choice that your parents had made, and then often, if anything happened, nothing would really come out of any sort of recourse if you chose to go and, chase it to try to get justice for yourself. Conversion therapy is not common anymore. We still have quite a few states that have it, but you don't really see it done too often anymore. And then it's also being listed as illegal in a lot of other states. And now if you go and submit somebody to conversion therapy in almost every state, it's listed as abuse, regardless of whatever reasoning that you had for sending your child into conversion therapy. Religious reasoning can't really be used as an excuse anymore, which is really nice. Like, a lot of things have changed over the last 35 years. It's definitely not what it used to be. I feel like the movement is kind of focusing on the wrong things these days. It's not really anything productive. I feel like it's mainly a bunch of pissing and moaning on social media that never really goes anywhere. And I feel that the trans community is not really properly represented anymore. So when I was growing up, trans people took to the streets often. They put in a lot of the groundwork those older populations did, So my generation didn't really have to struggle with it as hard. It wasn't really so much a case of, are we doing work? It was the question of, how much work have we done today? And nowadays, I don't really see a lot of the work going in. What I see is primarily a bunch of influencers that talk about being trans, and they're very, very quick to go and shill, to be supported and stuff. They're like, well, if you like my content, go ahead and support me here. And so I don't really think any of these influencers are proper representations for the community, because they're quick to try to collect money anywhere they can, but they don't really do anything to advance the demographic at all. They'll make posts about going on vacation and going to all these places and getting surgery and stuff, but they're not really doing anything for the people that a lot of them claim to represent by going and doing these media posts. I had realized things were wrong when I found myself asking the question of, I was sitting on TikTok a while back, and I had asked the question of, what is this influencer doing for the community? It turns out they weren't really doing much of anything, and so thinking that it was just this one influencer, I just kind of flaked it off more or less, and I had just kind of moved on. And I noticed that across the various social media platforms that it would become a repeating pattern of sorts. So the fact of the matter is that most of us live in a state of deep poverty. Medical is not accessible to us. They're just really, life is not great for the mass majority of trans people. And I notice a lot of trans influencers just kind of go and they try to live this lifestyle and stuff and portray this lifestyle that is not really reachable for really any of the demographic that goes and looks up to them, and I find it to be relatively awful. I kind of wish that there was more boots on the ground, because trans people have been under attack for quite some time now, but influencers don't really seem to be doing anything productive with it. It's just kind of begging for money and then failing to really advance anything, and I don't really care for that too much. So I feel that a lot of these influencers aren't really fit to be representatives of our community and such. I don't really care for various facets of the trans community, more specifically medicalists. a lot of people have a tendency to say, oh, well, being trans is rooted in a medical nature and this and that, and they try to do the whole, you're only trans if you suffer from dysphoria defense, and it just doesn't really work, I don't think. I know when I was growing up, I realized something was off, but I wasn't so overwhelmingly uncomfortable that I was considering killing myself or anything like that. I kind of largely viewed myself as a child being in a natural state, more or less. I was like, oh, this is, how I feel, this is how I was built, more or less, being intersex, this is perfectly fine. It wasn't really until I had started mingling with society at large that I had the thought rooted in me that, none of this is quote-unquote natural. And it was normally those that had dabbled in Christianity that would be pushing this narrative normally. So I find when dealing with a lot of medicalists, they try to reduce people down to being in boxes, more or less. And I don't really care for that because I've always viewed being trans as the ultimate sexual liberation and stuff, and the ultimate form of self-expression, because you're literally taking your body, realizing that, you would like to change it to be more comfortable with yourself, and then going and taking steps to do so. But there's also a lot of trans folks out there that realize they're trans but never do any such thing. Like, they don't go and get SRS, they just go and get on hormones and stuff. A lot of trans folks don't get FFS or anything like that, and that's perfectly fine. Some people don't want it, a lot of people just can't afford it because surgeries are expensive, especially orchiectomies and everything else. And yet for a long time now, medicalists have kind of just reduced themselves down to mental illness and needing surgery and all these other things, and I've never really agreed with it. And so I try to stay away from medicalists whenever I can, because they just kind of disgrace themselves by equating themselves to nothing more than a mental illness diagnosis. And going from there, when I have always viewed being trans as so much more than that. I don't really care for the argument that they have of, well, you're not trans if you're not on hormones, you're not trans if you don't get SRS, like they try to really reduce everything down to nothing more than medical parts, and it's never really been that great. Like, not every trans person can go and afford hormones, not every trans person can go and afford surgeries, and I find that the idea of being trans being reduced down to what you can afford is relatively ugly, and it is very counterproductive. I really don't care for how a lot of medicalists try to say that non-binary folks are not trans folks. I have a sister that's non-binary and stuff, and she's very much so trans. She's also queer. And she has always had my support. Now, me, myself, I don't really understand non-binary in its entirety. And she does a pretty good job, helping me understand it and stuff. But the way that I've always understood non-binary is a melding of the two. Whereas being gender fluid is going back and forth. And being gender neutral is just not recognizing it in its entirety. So, she's always had my support and stuff, and I just never really understood why many medicalists could sit there and say, oh, hey, well, non-binary people are not trans people, they shouldn't be a part of, our community and such, and, non-binary, like if you're mashing two genders together, with no real sort of gap between them, I do believe that is a form of transgenderism as well, because you're taking the norm and you're flipping it on its head. So I've never really cared for the entire list of medicalist arguments. I find them to be very nasty people. They kind of remind me of a lot of the gays in the 1980s that were biphobic, that felt you either had to be straight or you had to be gay. You couldn't be, someone in between. And I just really kind of hated that aspect of it. I don't think it's really great that a lot of those that believe in the medicalist aspect of it to really think that it's okay to be shackled to a pharmaceutical company for the rest of your life. You know, like, that's one of the main reasons why a lot of trans people that do come out, they're like, you know, I enjoy being trans, but, you know, with various medicines that we need and hormones and stuff that we need being locked behind a paywall with no stable access to them, you know, I don't really feel like I can go and achieve, you know, who I need to be, more or less. And so I feel that being trans kind of transcends whatever hormone you stick in your body. If you look at older cultures and stuff, way before we started synthesizing hormones, you know, they had a tendency to either dress masc or dress femme. It didn't really matter. You know, like, being trans in general pretty much predates medicalism in its entirety. And so I kind of view the medicalist aspect of things to be incredibly brain damaged and stuff, and it's reductionism at its finest, more or less, and I never really had cared for that too much. At the end of the day, being trans is a spectrum. It's not quite male, it's not quite female. I find that it's a wide spectrum of things. You've got those that get bottom surgery, you have those that get top surgery, you have those that get phalloplasties, you have those that get boob jobs, butt jobs, everything in between, you know, like, you have a wide spectrum of things that people go and get to go and be comfortable with themselves. You have some people that realize that they're just the opposite gender and they don't modify themselves at all, and, you know, quite frankly, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. Trying to reduce people down to such strict lines is a very ugly way of doing things, and I strongly feel that all it does is breed division. You know, being trans is all about the freedom to do with yourself whatever the hell you want, and then I feel when you go and try to reduce it down to being nothing more than a medical diagnosis, you miss the entire point. You know, you kind of miss the entire point of us being trans in its entirety. In many ways, I think this kind of stems from the older generations that would refer to themselves as transsexuals. I was on the tail end of that for a while. I was kind of like that middle generation, you know, where the older trans people behave a lot like vintage gays, where they are not very apt at latching on to new terminology whatsoever and new ways of thinking. In many ways, they kind of remind me of dinosaurs because they're failing to adapt. So with a lot of older trans folks, I find that, from my experience at least, and I've yet to see an outlier in this, most of the older trans folks define their transness not generally by who they are, but by the medications that they've taken and the surgeries that they've had. And I find it to be really, really sad because, you know, they kind of reduce themselves in that regard. And so they'll fight tooth and nail about it. It's not really that great, you know. They'll be like, well, I'm not transgender, I'm transsexual because my sex didn't line up, you know, and so I'm a man living as a woman, or I'm a woman living as a man. But the thing is if you were really, you know, if you really believe that you're a man, if you're stating that you're a man and stuff in your entirety, living as X, Y, and Z, then why would you go through the effort of going through various surgeries and hormones and everything else to go and be the opposite gender, well, the opposite gender, sex, whatever you'd like to call it? Why would you make the effort for it? Technically speaking, you would still believe that, you know, you were like a man or a woman before transitioning. And so I find it to be really weird because it almost feels like a certain type of appeasement to a lesser extent. It almost feels like a certain type of appeasement towards cishet people, because with the mass majority of cishet people, they're like, well, you know, if you go and admit that you used to be X, Y, and Z, you know, we will accept you in society. And with a lot of those older generations, I found that they were willing to bend over backwards to appease people. They just really did not give a shit about them. I just kind of look at it and I say to myself, my God. Now, the term transgen and transsex, a lot of people use them interchangeably. I don't. I think that they're both accurate to a certain lesser extent when referring to trans folks. I think the transsex is accurate for a lot of people because obviously, you know, when they transition, it's because they're not satisfied with the sex that they were born as. And so they get hormones and surgery and everything else to go and be content with themselves, which is perfectly fine. But I think that transgender as well is also a equally valid but separate term that mainly caters towards societal expectations and standards of what we believe male, female, and people in between to be. I view them as separate entities, but both equally valid. And to a certain lesser extent, I believe that most trans people in general are transgender and transsex. On one end, many trans people go and get on hormones and have surgeries to go and alter their sex and stuff to be satisfied with themselves, or you have those like me that are born in between. And on the other end of things, the social aspect, they dress with the sex and the gender that they identify with to be comfortable with themselves. So I think that both are valid to a certain lesser extent. They're different facets of the same belief, essentially. You know, one is more of a medical aspect, and then the other is more of a social transitionary aspect. And so I don't really have problems with either or. With me, it's like, you know, I started HRT because, you know, I just wanted to be at home in my own skin. I mean, I wasn't dying from dysphoria or trying to hang myself or anything, but I was like, you know, this is who I am. You know, this is what I need to do to be who I am completely, more or less. I didn't go off the deep end with like SRS and stuff. I'm already intersex and surgeons already have like a hard time with me, so I didn't really want to complicate things. But I did what I needed to do to go and take care of myself, essentially. I don't really agree with the current movement, mainly because it feels like it's a lot of appeasement. Like, I see two main demographics out of the current movement. I see the demographic that just wants to dominate everything. Everything is kind of like a running riot and an outrage and stuff. And they go out of their way to go and show how pissed off, you know, they are. And that can be used effectively sometimes if it has the right reasoning in back of it, you know. And then you have those that are so starved to be accepted by society that they're willing to bend over backwards, essentially, to just be accepted. So it's like, you know, whatever you want to classify me as. And I typically see this out of trans people that have a tendency to gravitate over towards right-wing ideology, that are so desperate to be accepted and stuff that they'll literally say whatever, do whatever just to be accepted. And it's really just awful, because I don't think that you should go and endlessly sacrifice yourself to go and be, you know, accepted by people that already probably don't really appreciate you much to begin with. And so I never really cared for the constant appeasement, the people pleasing or anything like that. At the end of the day, people come as they are, you know. If you have to go and endlessly kiss someone's ass and bend over backwards for the sake of them going and accepting you, then something is seriously wrong. Oh, man. So, I think about it a lot sometimes. You know, like I kind of look at how the modern population of trans people just kind of go and, you know, they're kind of divvied up into these two categories, it seems. And every now and then, I see people that are in between and stuff, and, you know, but I don't really see it too often, but I see these two main demographics just kind of slugging it out. And, you know, you have one that's like starved for acceptance and is willing to kiss anybody's ass, and they run over other trans people trying to go and get that acceptance, and then you have the other side of things that isn't really vying for equality anymore. It's kind of just vying for straight domination because the bullshit's been going on for so long that, there's no tolerance left, which, is understandable to a certain lesser extent, but can be counterproductive as well. So after a while, I just kind of left the demographic, more or less, that particular group, and I still consider myself trans, trans femme, obviously, but I don't really feel like I'm attached to the movement anymore because it's not really moving in the right direction, per se. And I never really cared for that too much, like I'll literally support any trans person I see, for the most part, as long as they're not like pushing some batshit crazy stuff like, we're gonna go ahead and say, hey, yeah, you're not trans if you can't do X, Y, and Z. I don't really believe in supporting that too much, but for the mass majority of trans folks, as long as they're not like outwardly attacking people, and stuff, I feel like we can go and get along very, very well. I don't really identify with the current movement too much. We definitely feel like separate things at this point. I feel like I'm kind of, as a trans person, just wanting to live my life and not be murdered, and then everybody else is just kind of like, you must adhere to us and obey us, and I don't really care for that too much. It just feels overtly hostile for the sake of being overtly hostile, and then of course I don't really care for medicalists as well, which is kind of sad, really. I feel like there's a lot of division in my community and stuff, and I think that the current movement and belief system is aggravating the hell out of it, and it's just really awful, I think. I don't really care for how the influencers will endlessly feed off of us while going and making a life off of it while not advancing the movement in a positive or, well, even really meaningful manner. It's just not really that great. So, most of the people that I hang out with are trans. My sister's trans, her girlfriend's trans, like I very much so hang out predominantly in the queer community, but it's just really weird how we're just kind of going about cannibalizing ourselves and each other, just trying to survive more or less, and I find it to be a very awful thing. So, it's sad, but it is what it is. There's not really a whole hell of a lot of kindness left, and after a while, I just get tired of watching people eat each other. I just kind of want to live my life, be happy in my life, treat others well, have others treat me well, just the real basic kind of common sense shit that you would kind of expect out of people, or at least you would like to believe you could expect out of people. And, it is what it is, I guess. So, moving on to the LGBT community. Do I support the current movement? Do I support the LGBT? I support LGBT people as I am one of them, but I do not support the current movement. In many ways, I find the current movement to be incredibly erosive. It's not something that I really get to say too often, but it's not really what I think it should be, and I find a lot of it to be incredibly counterproductive, mainly due to the hostilities that they have these days towards, pretty much anything and everything. So growing up, I was around a lot of queer people. I didn't quite know that I was queer yet myself. I was still thumbing around and figuring myself out, and, down the road I learned that I'm pansexual and stuff. Love everybody and anybody, quite literally. And so I've been out of the closet for quite some time. Growing up around a bunch of older gays and stuff, mainly the Stonewall gays, it was very much so a struggle of, we're not so much about societal acceptance, we're more about being able to go and live our lives without the constant threat of death, which completely understandable. So growing up, I had this mentality for a while that, it's just best to let people just be themselves and to live and let live. But I find that with the current community, it's not really that great because, again, it's more about domination and exclusion. So growing up, watching a bunch of the older gays was kind of a weird thing for me because a lot of the time with the older gays, I noticed that there is a staggering amount of them that are transphobic as well as biphobic. With a lot of the older gays that I used to hang out with, they had very black and white thinking. I think when it came to how sexuality was portrayed, you were either straight or you were gay. You couldn't be bi, you couldn't be pan, you know. You couldn't do any of these things because they kind of had this solid belief that you had to be one or the other. There was also various issues within the gay community as well. When it came to older gays, a lot of them are incredibly transphobic because they themselves have a tendency to, and it's mainly the lesbians, I noticed, like the older lesbians, they kind of have this idea trapped in their head that if you go and allow trans women into the community, that you're just basically letting men take everything over and, you know, all this other crap that, well, turned out to be bullshit. And so I would see that a lot, and I never really understood it too much, because as somebody that was born in between, it just seemed kind of, well, to be honest with you, it just seemed really fucking stupid. So I do have older gay friends that are lesbians and stuff, and yeah, they openly admit that trans women don't take anything away from standard cis women, more or less. They're not a threat, but I think the main issue that I typically see with a lot of the older gays is a lot of them have a tendency, especially if they're older lesbians, they have a tendency to be kind of being strangled by feminism, primarily. So you would literally go and you would see like a lot of these older lesbians kind of go and try to exclude trans women, even though we have very much so a rich history pushing women's rights, while going and calling us men, more or less, and then trying to have a bunch of crackpot bullshit arguments as to why we shouldn't be in the community. So it's kind of a little known fact that gays and trans people have been lumped together in the LGBT for a while now, and a lot of this has a tendency to stem from the DSM, because being gay and being trans were both at one point in time listed as sexual deviancies. And so we were kind of right there on the same page, you know, with each other being listed as psychosexuality for a while. And so that's kind of how we had the same boneyard and stuff. I never really understood how, regarding most feminist lesbians in the older LGBT community, I never really understood how you could claim that you were railing against the patriarchy and, you know, securing women's rights and all this other stuff, and then turn around, look at trans women and sit there and say, oh, well, you know, they're not like us, therefore they're bad. They would literally go and mimic the same talking points as people that would rail against gay people, men that felt that women shouldn't have rights, things like that. It never really made much sense to me to claim that you're railing against the patriarchy while going and mimicking all of its talking points and carrying all of its damage. So I would literally sit there and I would witness this for a while, and I wouldn't really laugh, I wouldn't really cry, I would just kind of look at it and go, you know, I would just kind of hum a little bit, and it was very, very obscure to me. And so when it comes to older gays, I don't really like, most of the older LGBT I find is incredibly bigoted in most regards and stuff. They carry a lot of the damage that they were trying to get away from, per se. You know, they're like, oh, well, we're trying to get away from people hating on us and people trying to kill us for being different, while at the same time going and mimicking the same behaviors that they had sought to escape. And so I find a lot of it to be very counterproductive, and I find that as a queer that is, living through this hellscape that we call America and stuff, I find that the damage is never really healed. It's just kind of transferred to a new generation and stuff, So it's like you had the damage that the older gays had to go and deal with, and then that damage was later reapplied and passed down to the newer gays using the same talking points a lot of the time. And so the greater question is that, okay, we can recognize a pattern here. How do we go about mitigating it, more or less? How do we go about actually fixing it? And so the weird thing is you would have to openly admit, I think, in order to make progress, you would have to openly admit at that point that there was a problem. Does anybody want to admit that there's a problem? The younger generations say yes, there absolutely is a problem. The older generations say no. So with the younger generations, I find that they suffer from a lot of the same issues that the trans community itself suffers from, frequently being divided into two categories. You have the younger gays that are like, hey, being gay is okay, nobody really gives a shit. And then you have the other gays, the other demographic that literally tries to appease society because they're afraid that if they don't keep kissing their asses, that they're going to lose rights and everything else. So with a lot of the older gays and a lot of the younger gays that kind of lean over to this, what it boils down to is they have a tendency to think in binaries where they're like, you're either lesbian, gay, or bisexual. You can't be queer, you can't be trans. They literally try to cut the tail end off of the acronym. And it is a very, very ugly thing to do, because a lot of the time when they go and they try to do some exclusionist bullshit, they use the same talking points that a lot of the people from the 1950s and 60s used when they were advocating for the removal of gay people from society. And so they're literally riddled with a lot of the same cancers that people were back then. Some of them even go as far as to mimic talking points from Nazi Germany, saying, well, we can't let queers or trans people in the community because we got to think of the kids and, like all this other stuff. And the more you look at it, the more you realize that there is a heavy amount of brain rot, I think. So a lot of the younger generation that has a tendency to go and lean more towards right-wing ideology, they have this idea in their head that, if they go and cater and act like what everybody else wants them to be, that they'll be accepted and stuff. And we see this a lot with gays that are heavily involved in republicanism and stuff. A lot of them have this ingrained brain rot that they honestly believe that if they behave how the Republicans would like them to behave, and if they go and mimic the same talking points and all this other stuff, that right-wingers will go and accept them and everything else. And the interesting thing about it is that history has a tendency to repeat sometimes. We saw the same thing in Nazi Germany, where there was like a lot of gays that were working for Hitler, and then they thought that they would be spared for helping the Third Reich, and then when Adolf found out about it, he just had them all killed. He just kind of rolled their bodies in the same pit with everybody else. So I see this a lot with people that have a tendency to lean over and hold up right-wing ideology. Many of them have a tendency to firmly believe that if they go and hold this up, that they, are always going to be, loved and loved and accepted and everything else. And that is not always the case. It's really not, because at that point, since you're so hell-bent on all the appeasement and stuff and trying to kiss ass and everything else, and what you become at that point's a tool, more or less. You're literally a tool to push their movement. And the interesting thing about tools is that once they stop being useful, they're discarded. That's kind of how that is. And so we see a lot of the younger gays that are right-wingers try to be trans exclusionary or queer exclusionary. A lot of them don't really like people being queer in general because they have a tendency to think, oh, you have to, always know who you are and what you are. And there's like some people out there that they're queer because they're like, okay, well, I'm figuring myself out. Do I like men? Do I like women? It's, perfectly okay to be queer. And then a lot of them try to usher forth the bullshit of, well, if we let trans people into the LGBT, it's going to be bad for us and it's going to make us look bad, and we need to be able to fit in, because if we can't fit in, we'll lose our rights. And newsflash, you're going to lose your rights regardless when you stop being useful. That's just how that is. So I always thought that it was really weird when a lot of the younger and older gays would sit there and try to appease these people that in all honesty did not have their best interests at heart and could not really give two fucks about them. People that would probably be secretly plotting your death behind the scenes a lot of the time, So I just felt that it's really weird because there's always this knee-jerk reaction and stuff when you look at like a lot of these other gays, and it's very strange to literally watch people screech for rights while going and screaming that others shouldn't have rights. It's kind of like this panic button, so they'll go and mimic whatever talking point is needed to try to survive more or less, because they're so afraid of anything being set back that, they're willing to bend over backwards to do whatever it takes for the sake of survival, even if that means becoming hateful towards another demographic that's harmless. So I don't really trust any of the modern movements at all for the current trans movement or the LGBT movement, because it's just riddled with too much bullshit. I have adopted the policy of, if you're cool, I'm cool, more or less. That's really where I'm at with that. And a lot of people don't really seem to realize that when you go and you keep people divided like that, it's literally society doing its job to try to maintain the status quo, because a lot of people have a tendency to be scared of change, which I can understand being scared of change to a certain lesser extent, but when you're sitting there and you're like, oh, these people shouldn't have rights, and you're willing to eat other people over it, it's just really not that great, I don't think. So I feel that people have the right to be whoever they want to be, or whoever they need to be. If they're figuring themselves out, that's pretty much, on them at that point. That's the journey that they have to take. If you're trans and, you just feel like you need hormones, that's fine. If you're trans and you want SRS, that's also fine. If you're trans and you don't want any of it or can't afford any of it, that, again, is fine. If you're gay and, you feel that having trans people in the community is problematic, then sorry for you. Maybe it's time to go and examine yourself a little bit. I feel like a lot of the rhetoric the last while is just really kind of fucking awful. Sitting there kind of going and plagiarizing people as coming for your kids and shit. And I think at that point they would have to be more worried about the Catholic Church, not generally trans people. I'm sure good old Padre is pulling little Timmy out of the pews as we speak. So, but as it currently stands right now, I kind of view both movements as just a massive grift. I don't trust them. I'm never going to trust them. I believe that everybody should have rights to, be their authentic selves and stuff, but I don't really think that anybody really has the right to be hateful. If you're holding up something that's hateful, I honestly believe that it's not worth having. Literally, there's really no reason to be hateful. If you're going and trying to trash another community because you're worried about losing your own rights, then maybe instead of trashing the community that is going and trying to survive and be themselves and everything else, maybe you should start trashing the community that's asking you to do so. Like a lot of people don't really look at it. They don't look at that at all, and it's just really kind of sad, I think. It's the amount of hate that people carry these days is truly awe-inspiring. And I think it's like really sad how comfortable people have gotten with their hate. Like, they get so comfortable with it. And I think a lot of it has to do with the internet, because if you notice with hateful people, they kind of push these agendas and stuff. They're never dumb enough to do it in real life unless they have a ton of people around them, right? Like, you never see anybody do this shit in real life unless they're that far gone. But I feel a lot of people are very quick to do it over the internet because they have the anonymity of a screen, which really isn't so much anonymous anymore because it's very easy to find people now. But they just kind of have a tendency to go and have this mentality of, oh, it's just the internet, it's really not that serious. And so they're like, well, if people are mad at me and my junk opinion, you know, I could just go and log out of Twitter or whatever the case may be. But in my heart of hearts, I will always support fellow trans people. I will always support, you know, fellow queers and stuff that are trying to live their best lives and trying to just do so in a manner that works for them, you know. But I'm not likely to support any trans person that's hateful or bigoted, any queer person that's hateful or bigoted. I just don't really like hateful people in general. I never have. I doubt I ever will. And so it's kind of a strange thing, because a lot of people try to lump me into the community and stuff. They're like, well, you're LGBT, isn't that great? Oh, don't get me wrong, I love being queer. I just don't care for the modern movement. I don't really care for the modern movement. I don't like the older generation's bigotries. I don't like the current generation's appeasement and ass-kissing. I just don't really like any of it. I just want people to be able to sit down and be themselves. You know, like, come as you are. If you're gay, you're gay. If you're straight, you're straight. Fuck it. Nobody gives a shit. You know, if you're trans, you do whatever the hell it is you need to do to be content with yourself. If you're trans and you're already content with yourself, ditto. Non-binary people are completely fucking valid. Nobody's ever going to be able to change my mind on that. You know, it's really kind of ridiculous to only look at two ends of the spectrum when there is a whole demographic of people making up the entire middle section of it. So I just find everything really disgusting. You know, I don't really like all of the division that is in all of these communities. I don't like all the hate. I don't really like the constant shilling. I just really can't fucking stand a lot of what's going on. You know, be whoever you want to be, fuck whoever the hell you want to fuck. Just keep it consensual, please. That's all I'm asking here. You know, let's exercise a healthy dose of common sense with this crap. You know, let's go ahead and just fucking leave everybody alone. Let them live their lives, please. You know, if your kid comes up and says, hey, I'm trans, let them figure it out. Like, seriously, let them think on it and stuff. We all know the kids do silly shit all the time, but don't sit there and say, you know, hey, I don't think you're trans, or hey, you know, I don't think that you have any right to be this. Just let people figure themselves out. Let them live and learn. Literally. It's their body. It's their life. They're going to have to go and live the rest of their life how they choose to live their life. They're going to have to live inside that body for the rest of their existence. Until they die. Then they can go and become a ghost and proceed to fuck with people. For as long as it is. Well, as long as it is. As long as ghosts last, I guess. You know, just let people be people. Don't be hateful towards people. Don't be a fucking asshole. I mean, all of this is just really kind of common sense, I feel, at this point. And unfortunately, in modern society, common sense is not so common anymore. So, yeah, that's pretty much how I feel on everything. You know, if you feel that trans people shouldn't be around, go fuck yourself. It doesn't matter if you're straight. It doesn't matter if you're gay. If you think the gay people shouldn't be around, again, kindly, go fuck yourself. Nobody gives a shit. You know, just let people live and let live. It's really not that difficult to not give a shit what other people do with themselves. I do it all the time. If it makes them happy, be happy for them. As long as they're not walking around murdering people, you really can't go wrong. So, this is pretty much going to wrap this video. For all those that came out and stuff, I hope you have some clarification now. I hope you guys are doing well, and as always, be good to yourselves and each other. Till next time. Hey guys, how you doing? I hope you're doing well tonight. I am back with another installment of Raimes Mailbag. At this point, I have decided that I'm probably going to start stuffing multiple installments in one video because it's weird having like a 3-hour long video with like just a 40-minute segment in it. It's very strange for me. So I may shove these into a more condensed form. I'm not sure yet. So, today we're going to talk about political correctness. I had somebody make the comment the other day that I am very politically correct and they don't like it. And so I've also been asked, do you consider yourself politically correct? Yes and no. I feel in the current day and age that people have literally lost the ability to communicate with each other. People cannot go and read intent for shit anymore, like at all. They don't understand how people talk to them. They just literally have no intelligence socially anymore. So anybody that has ever had to deal with me, they know that I can be pretty warm. I can either be really warm or really abrasive. So as an end result, people that deal with me, it's not unusual for me to call them hon or bud. If I'm dealing with a small child, I'll call him kiddo. You know, that is literally just the Southwest in me. And so nowadays, most people have a chronic raging stick up their ass when you go and you use these, I guess you would call them terms of endearment. Now, the truth of the matter is that these terms don't really have any sort of meaning to them. I know a lot of people kind of go and they have a tendency to say, well, you know, that's being sexist or it's infantile language habits and things like that. But the truth of the matter is I don't really have a tendency to look at people as being above or below me. You know, they're just people, essentially. And when I get relaxed, you know, like when I'm happy to see somebody or I'm feeling really, really relaxed, this is how I address people. It's been like that since the Stone Age and stuff. And a lot of people have a tendency to be bothered by it, especially in a public setting. I noticed that it largely depends on what kind of people you're dealing with. If you're going and dealing with anybody in the medical industry, they're going to have a fit about it. If you're dealing with people in gas stations, they don't care. A lot of them actually find it really nice and warm. It really just kind of depends on where you're at, who you're dealing with, things like that. So as time has gone on, a lot of people have a tendency to go and have a fit because they cannot tell the difference between when somebody is being warm versus when somebody is being nasty and sexist and all this other shit. So sometimes what I have a tendency to do is I will pop the question of, well, okay, how do you feel that, you know, that was being used? I'll go ahead and address it correctly. You know, I'll sit there and be like, instead of being an asshole about it, I'll go ahead and ask you a question and, you know, we'll sit down and we'll talk about it because human beings just don't know how to speak to each other anymore. They can't tell if somebody's being warm. They can't tell if they're being attacked. Like, they literally just don't have any sort of capacity to properly socialize anymore. So, a lot of people have really weird tendencies when it comes to it. Now, if somebody comes up to me, I get addressed by all sorts of manners of things. I've been called ma'am a fair bit. I've been called sir, you know, on occasion. I've been called hun, sweetheart, all that stuff. If like I'm in a bar or if I'm at a gas station or even a lot of the drivers that are hired to take me to my appointments and stuff, you know, I have to go and read what people are saying, more or less. And I have to be able to read the intent behind it, you know, like I actually, with me having very little sight, audio is pretty much everything. So what it boils down to is I'll pay attention to what they're saying. I'll pay attention to the tone that it's being said in, how it's being used, things like that. And I'll make the judgment on whether or not it was being used appropriately. I find that the mass majority of people do not have this ability anymore, especially those that work in quote unquote professional settings. And so I find that it's really, really strange. There doesn't really seem to be any sort of universal standard for it. And so when I go and I look at like people bitching about political correctness and stuff, it's always been kind of an oddball thing. First and foremost, I think that people should be treated kindly. You know what I mean? Like, they shouldn't be treated like shit, you know? If you want to be a dickhead in your off time, that's fine. You shouldn't really make it other people's problem. You know, that's just kind of how that is, more or less. Like, I've got plenty of problems just like the next person, and I don't really enjoy dumping them on other people. I view it widely as inappropriate. So I can understand some people being offended by all sorts of stuff, especially those in the disabled community. You know, they don't really like being addressed in specific ways because a lot of the time, a lot of these terminologies that we have, especially in American culture, are literally rooted in racism, sexism, homophobia sometimes. Every now and then, with homophobia and stuff, we have a tendency to go and reclaim that terminology that was used in a homophobic fashion, like calling somebody queer, for example. With older folks, you call them a queer, you know, they're going to take it in a very homophobic fashion. But if you look at a lot of the newer generations and stuff, and you go and you call them queer, they're like, yeah, I'm queer. You know, like I'm gay, I'm bi, whatever. You know, the terminology has a tendency to change. So, as far as political correctness, I don't think that I'm really that politically correct at all. I have a tendency to ask people how they would like to be addressed a lot of the time because I just feel that it's being a decent human being, more or less. A lot of the time, you know, a lot of people are really, really cool about it. Some people are really weird about it. I find that since people don't really have the ability to gauge intent anymore, if you ask them, you know, hey, what would you like me to call you? They have a tendency to freak out. For example, in the medical industry, with me being legally blind, there's plenty of people that work the front reception desks and they wear name tags, but since I'm blind, my blind ass can't read that. So, most of the time with medical workers and stuff, they will not give you their name right off the bat. You know, they're like, hi, how are you doing? Well, they don't even ask you how you're doing. They're just like, hi, you know, and you'll be like, okay, I'm checking in for X, Y, and Z. And most of the time, you never really get a name. Well, when you can't see the name tag, it provides a certain degree of hell to try to overcome. So this has a tendency to go and create issues for me, I think. So one of the main reasons why I go and treat people warmly is because I'm trying to breed a certain level of comfort within them and stuff. And so a lot of people get bent out of shape about it. I know that when I was on the phone with a medical worker for Tucson ENT a little bit back, she had a fit because she did not bother to give me her name. She did not, you know, call me and say, hi, my name is blah, blah, blah with Tucson ENT. I'm looking for Ray Friedman. You know, are they available? No name was given. So when the call was picked up, I was like, hey, hon, how you doing? And she had gone ballistic. Instead of sitting there saying, hey, this person's happy to see me, you know, they're asking me how I am. Obviously, you know, this person wants me to have a good day. They went and they had a fit. So I think with most demographics, they don't really know how to gauge intent anymore. They just don't really know how to be social anymore. And this is coming from somebody that is not very social themselves. I don't really like being around people that much, but I still gauge intent. And so for a lot of people, I think that while we become more intelligent as a species, we become completely and utterly socially inept in some regards. I think the internet probably had a lot to do with that because most people can't gauge intent over it. And then when you go and you spend so much time on it, you know, obviously you're going to have that discrepancy there, I think, past a certain point. But I have made it a policy to just ask people what they're okay with. A lot of people these days are afraid of asking questions because, the answer sometimes can be scary, which, I agree. Sometimes things like that can be very scary, but I would rather look like a dumbass for asking a question than to just assume. And it's always been like that with me, I think. And so sometimes when I'm going and talking to somebody, I'll be like, hey, how would you like me to address you? And be like, well, you can call me blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, that works. Whatever. And we'll go ahead and we'll run with it. But I feel that these days a lot of people are offended for the sake of being offended. This tendency has even gone as far as to edit my humor a fair bit, which is actually kind of awful because I feel like a lot of people can't really laugh anymore. Like, I laugh at myself all the time, like I'm a walking, talking contradiction, I find, as my life goes on. And so I don't really, when it comes to my personal life, I don't really have a lot of political correctness. It doesn't really exist on me too much. Like, I make fun of myself all the time. I was sitting down and playing some games with my sister. We were playing Resident Evil 6 together, and there was a chase sequence, and we were both running away from, this chopper that was crashing down. And I had made the joke. I was like, "You fucking non-binary bitch! You're gonna leave my fucking queer ass back here." And I had done the joke, and we had both laughed at it really hard and stuff, and we didn't really think too much of it. I think political correctness shifts a lot of the time based off of not only who you're dealing with, but whether or not they're a member of your tribe as well. Like, who you're socializing with, I think, counts for a lot as well. I've got black friends that have literally given me a literal physical N-word pass card. And it's really weird because they're like, as long as you have this pass, you can say it as much as you want. I'll be honest with you, my white ass wouldn't be caught dead doing that shit. It is all fun and games until I am in the middle of Baltimore trying to pull that shit off and realizing that my lifespan has gotten exponentially shorter. Like, it's not something I'm gonna do, man. Like, it also depends on what you're trying to be politically correct about. Like, even though a lot of my black friends are like, hey, you can say the N word whenever the hell you want, I'm not really comfortable with it because I realize that that terminology is rooted in racism, and I just do not like racism. So I don't use it. Like, I carry the card in my wallet, but I don't actually use it. I find that a lot of people can't really laugh anymore because of political correctness. I think the first casualty was probably comedy, but to be fair, I think comedians had a large part to play in that, especially when you start looking at like your late 80s, early 90s comics and stuff. And I think that there's a difference between laughing with people versus laughing at people. Like, it's one thing to go and make a joke out of it, but it's another thing to turn them into the joke, I feel. And so I sit down, I think about it quite often, actually, because just with a lot of the comedy and a lot of the groups that I go and I hang out with and stuff, there just really is no filter. And so we kind of see this as a group. We're like, oh, okay, well, we're kind of making fun of ourselves here. This is okay. But I think when you're dealing with like an outside group, such as, any sort of other race or any other sort of demographic, you kind of have to be careful with it because they may be cool with each other saying it, but with you being an outsider of sorts, they may not be cool with you saying it. So it's another thing I think that really needs to be paid attention to. Like, with my group of friends and stuff, pretty much it's, as far as you can go with it and stuff. We pretty much make fun of each other, we make fun of ourselves. It just doesn't really matter at that point. However, I am aware of society at large, especially with dealing with certain demographics of people that are not comfortable with it. I think that you have to examine what's good for yourself versus what other people would like to be addressed as. Like, for example, I really don't give a shit if people call me a cripple. To be fair, they're not wrong. My eyesight's gone, most of my spine's gone. Just everything's just fucking falling apart at that point. And I don't mind it. I don't mind the terminology behind it and stuff, but I can very easily see how other people would mind it. I think when it comes down to laughing at yourself, if you're willing to accept the fact that you're laughing at yourself and other people are laughing with you at it, you would also have to sit there and accept the inevitability that not everybody is going to be like you, not everybody's going to go and laugh at it and stuff. And so this is kind of where reading people kind of comes into play a fair bit. And I think that I would probably have to use, oh man, old example, Dave Chappelle as an example of it. When I was going and watching one of his newer specials and stuff, he was pretty much ripping on the entire gay community and stuff, but I noticed as the special had gone on that he became progressively more and more bitter about it. And after a while, like when you go and you look at it and you kind of pick up on it, you realize, oh, hey, he's not laughing with us, he's laughing at us, he's not generally punching up, he's punching down. And when you go and you see a comic like that and you realize, like, you pick up on those subtle tones and stuff and you actually start paying attention to it, you realize that maybe political correctness is not such a bad thing. I know with certain friends that I hang out with and stuff, a lot of them are like, hey, I really don't like being referred to as this. I don't really like being referred to as this either, which is perfectly fine. If people sit down with me, right? Like if they say, hey, Raime, we need to have a talk, and they sit down with me and stuff, and they, orate what they need to me, I don't really like being called this. I find it kind of offensive. Here's why. I have zero issue correcting my behavior, more or less. That is literally a non-issue for me. I don't have any sort of issue addressing people how they want. Guys, girls, people in between, I honestly just don't really give a shit. It's nothing personal. It's just everybody has the right to be happy, if they want to be addressed a certain way. That's fine. If they don't like certain facets of my language, that's also fine. They don't have to like it. However, I feel as a person that just wants to be a decent human being and wants to do right by others, I feel that it's kind of an obligation past a certain point to literally sit there and say, oh, okay, well, I recognize what I'm doing is kind of fucked up to you, I'm sorry that, you don't really care for it. We're going to go ahead and we're going to be better about it. And so that's how I've chosen to live my life. Regarding my personal life, I have people that take stabs at me quite often, I think. And it really depends on, how they go about doing it and stuff. Some people, I can tell that they're maliciously doing it, and it does have a tendency to piss me off a fair bit, but I have a tendency to get them back pretty fast. And then you have others that I can tell that they say it strictly because they don't really know any better. And it's somewhat forgivable, I think. So I'll literally take him to the side and I'll explain things to him. I'll be like, hey man, this is why I don't really care for this. What do you think? And if I go and address it like this, a lot of the time it corrects the behavior and it's actually really, really cool of them. And then every now and then I just get one asshole who wants to die on that hill, and I just have a tendency to give them the third degree and stuff. And I don't really care for it, but sometimes it's needed. Like, I went over to a Circle K up in Tucson a couple weeks back, and this guy was pretty pissed off behind the counter and stuff, and he had labeled me a fag, essentially. And I was like, and I just kind of sat there, and I could tell that it was hateful and stuff, but I had made a joke out of it. And he had gotten upset because I flat out told him, I was like, the only reason that you're mad that I'm a fag is because I'm not blowing you. And it had kind of thrown fuel on the fire a fair bit and stuff. And, I guess I should have expected it when the guy was wearing a cross around his neck, but, So it's really kind of weird. Everybody kind of receives it differently. I think the most important thing is to be able to read people's intent. And if they're sitting down and if they don't like something, as long as they approach you reasonably about it and stuff, I feel that you could have probably, well, most likely a productive conversation about it, and people are just better, I think, when they just kind of sit down and they take each other into consideration and stuff. But I think things go south very quickly when people go about being assholes to one another. And so I'm kind of like in this middle ground, I guess. Like I can be politically correct when people have a desire for it, if they're actually offended and, they want the behavior to be corrected, that's fine. But I personally don't really strive for it. I give myself shit all the time. I give other people shit all the time. Friends, family members, I think that as I just kind of go and live life and stuff, the main rule that I try to go and follow is to, what I say at the end of pretty much every fucking video, to be good to yourself and each other. If somebody is, handicapped and stuff, and they just want to be referred to as handicapped, that's fine. I have zero issue with it. I have some friends that have cerebral palsy, and intellectual disabilities, and they'll come at me full force, and they'll sit there and say, "You mean to tell me that you let my retarded ass back here? I fucking can't stand you." And we laugh at it because we know that it's a joke and stuff. They laugh at themselves, I laugh at myself, and it's a very interesting time to be alive, I think, because on one end there is a portion of the population that just wants to desperately be able to go and laugh and make fun of shit. And then there is another demographic that is striving to get the dignity that they deserve and stuff, and so such things have a tendency to be offensive to them for the obvious reason. I think that at the end of the day, the best thing to do is to just ask, to sit down and, realize that everybody's human and to have concrete conversations about it. I feel that when we can sit down and have good conversations about it and to get to where, we need to be, that, it's a sign that society is improving, but I don't really see the point of kind of just walking around whining and bitching about, each and every little thing. And, as somebody that complains pretty heavily sometimes, as most people that are close to me already know, it's really just kind of a kind of thing that we're just going to be struggling with a fair bit, I feel. It's just, some of it makes sense, a lot of it doesn't make sense. It's just one of those things, I think. But at the end of the day, I feel that people should strive to be good to one another. If somebody doesn't like something, if they're being relatively chill about it, or even if they're being relatively hostile about it, I feel like that it's okay to go and have that conversation, because things only really get better when you go to tackle it, more or less, I feel. And so I don't really feel that the current society we're living in really has that capacity. I don't know if it's due to societal ineptitude or whatever the case may be, but it just really seems like we can't really read each other anymore. We don't really have a firm understanding of intent anymore. We just don't really have any sort of capacity to go and do anything meaningful with the human language. And then when you go and try to ask about it, there's open hostility. So it doesn't really make much sense to me, I think. So as far as I can tell, life is just going to be like this. There are those that are going to be offended. There are those that you're going to laugh with and everything else. And there are those that are going to be offended when I go and ask them questions, more or less, and it just doesn't really feel like human beings have the capacity to go and speak to one another anymore, and quite frankly, I think it's a goddamn shame. So this one is a little bit on the shorter side, but that is perfectly fine. We are going to go ahead and wrap it here so I can get on recording the next one as I go through these questions and stuff. So for all those that went ahead and stopped in, I appreciate your time and your effort. As always, be good to yourselves and each other. Take care now. Hey guys, how you doing? We are back with another round of Raimes Mailbag. And so this particular topic is going to be, what is ACAB? A lot of people have heard me mention ACAB in the background or hear me say, hey, I'm forever ACAB. And for those that don't know what ACAB is, well, what it's an acronym for per se is all cops are bastards. And it is the philosophy that there is no such thing as a good cop. Now, growing up, I was incredibly deluded and what I would call blue-washed. Because everybody in my family would be like, oh, cops are, there for you and this and that and everything else. And so I grew up in a very thick delusion thinking that this was the case. So growing up in a rough fashion, we would have to go and deal with the police every now and then, and I found that most of the time when you would have to go and be around officers, that they would frequently make the problem worse, not better. So I would go and I would observe this throughout my teens and stuff. Both my other brothers literally had issues. One of them was trying to be a drug dealer, the other one was busy being a drug addict, and so it wasn't unusual to see cops or have my brothers arrested or watch them get arrested somewhere else. And so it was really odd for me because I would go and I would look at these officers a lot of the time, and I realized that I would observe them and I would realize that things weren't really that great, that they don't really treat people well. And so moving into my 20s, I became incredibly aware of how awful cops are. The area that I live in, a lot of the cops are actually morally bankrupt, for lack of a better term. And so I just kind of stopped trusting them in their entirety. I think the biggest wake-up call for me was seeing how they treated black folks. That really fucking pissed me off, because I had made the observation that when I was younger and an officer would go and stop, like my mom and I, in Tucson, they wouldn't really treat us horribly. They'd be like, have a nice day. And so I would go and notice how they would treat black folks, and it would be like, the person that they're targeting is like an instant suspect, for example. And I noticed that the only real difference between my mom and I versus these black folks is literally the color of our skin. So I thought that I was being really paranoid for a while. I was like, no, it can't be that, and I continuously observed it, and then I also started cross-referencing to the Hispanic population down here. And I noticed that when officers would go and deal with white folks, you know, they would literally be friendly and stuff, but if they had to deal with Asian American folks, African American folks, and Hispanic American folks, they would go and treat them in incredibly abrasive fashions. You know, a lot of yelling, screaming, gun pointing, just crap that really shouldn't be happening. And so I noticed that race was definitely very much so a thing, and I didn't like that because I've been a firm believer for a while now, well, since birth more or less, that everybody should be treated evenly, you know, everybody's equal. And so I had continued observing this for a while, and I just kind of stopped trusting cops in their entirety. I would witness police brutality during riots quite often, and I didn't really care for it too much because 9 times out of 10 when there was a riot, it's normally something that they had done. Like, for example, the Phoenix PD had gone and killed a bunch of Hispanic teenagers saying that they were gang members, and these kids, their families were understandably upset. And so naturally, when they would go and challenge the police department, nothing would happen. Rioting was quite literally the next step because justice was never really truly served. And then, of course, you know, with rioting, the response to that is, you know, oh hey, how do we solve rioting? Oh, more brutality, you know, and it was just kind of this revolving thing for a while. And I just didn't really like it at all. So eventually, I had initially heard ACAB from my older brother, you know, and it had just kind of stuck. And so the counter argument to this is, of course, Blue Lives Matter and not all cops and everything else, but I'm a firm believer in ACAB because I find that cops often do not hold each other accountable. So if you're not really willing to hold what everybody says is a small minority of police officers accountable, wouldn't that technically make them all bastards? So this is why I frequently openly say that I am ACAB. Now, what I do support, however, is my local sheriff's department, and the reason why is because my sheriff's department is elected, more or less. And so a lot of people sit there and say, well, you know, what's the difference between sheriffs and just standard, like, inner city cops? Inner city cops are not very well regulated. Sheriff's departments, a lot of the time, are, and that's because the people frequently elect them to their positions. So a lot of the times with inner city cops, if an incident happens, nothing really ever comes from any sort of complaint. If it's taken to court, they just go and basically pay it off and kind of go their separate way. But with the sheriff's department, since they're elected, they're held to a much higher standard. Their accountability is often a lot higher as well, and I've always had nothing but I've always seen like nothing but good things out of my sheriff's department, especially towards indigenous folks, black folks, things like that. They treat everybody really well. And then my sheriff's department also has a lot of indigenous folks, African American folks, and even a fair bit of women as well, so I find that my local sheriff's department is incredibly diverse, which I can respect immensely. And so, with ACAB and stuff, a lot of people, well, with cops in general, a lot of people have a tendency to fetishize it a fair bit. You know, they'll sit there and say, well, these cops are our heroes, and things like that, and kind of just go down the line with it. But the thing is I don't really feel like standard police officers are really worth respecting until they get their shit together. The corruption is so damn high that you can literally cut it with a fucking knife. You know, it's that thick. And so I just don't really trust inner city cops at all. This has been compounded by the fact, I think, that I had, so most of my medical is up in Tucson and Phoenix, right? And so what I do is when I go and do my appointments, a lot of the time afterwards, since the drive is incredibly lengthy and very strenuous, I have a tendency to stop for food because my blood sugar is bouncing all over the place. And so a lot of the time in Tucson and Phoenix, I see a fair bit of homeless. And a lot of these people are incredibly thin. They just look like shit, and so what I'll do is I'll walk up to them and I'll ask, like, hey man, are you hungry? I won't give them cash because I don't know if they have like vices on the side or anything. I don't really want to contribute to that, but at the same time, I don't really want to watch them starve to death. So I'll flat out ask them, are you hungry? And they'll be like, yeah. So I'll literally walk into whatever fucking eatery it is that I'm going to at the time, and I'll sit there and say, hey, I would like a spare meal, and I would order it, and I would take it out to them. Well, it turns out that feeding the homeless in my state is illegal. And I've had plenty of officers literally go and sit there and threaten to arrest me for choosing to feed people because they firmly believe that I am contributing to the homeless problem. And so I will verbally spar with them quite often because I do get kind of sick of it and stuff, and I find it's really disgusting how you go and you have like all these officers going and picking on people that are already kind of society's most vulnerable, I've seen cops go and arrest homeless people quite literally for being homeless in public. Shit's insane. I just don't really care for it that much, and so as it stands right now, like, I have a fair bit of respect for my sheriff's department, but I'm not going to really ever have any respect for standard police departments and stuff because I see how they treat people, I see the discrepancies there, and I just don't really care for it. If I felt that they were holding each other accountable, if I felt that, there's any sort of consequence for them going and shooting people to death, then that would be one thing, but the thing is I routinely fail to see it. And so when you routinely fail to see it, eventually you just kind of sit there and say, okay, nothing's going to happen. And so this has been my opinion on it for a very long time. I know that there's going to be a lot of people that go and constantly scream, back the blue and all this crap, but to be honest with you, do we really want to sit there and back people that are already like being shown to murder people for breathing, more or less? And it's just really, really weird, and then the whole Blue Lives Matter bullshit is just rather insane because the only time I see Blue Lives Matter even flare up is when you have a police department murder somebody or murder a group of people, and they try to have a tendency to go and scream Blue Lives Matter as a distraction of sorts. Like, I never see anybody scream Blue Lives Matter when shit's doing alright, I always see people go and scream Blue Lives Matter whenever somebody's trying to hold a police department accountable, or when people finally go and, oh Jesus Christ, the George Floyd riots. Like when that poor man was murdered and stuff, when people had finally had enough and everything had started to boil over, they were very quick to be like, oh, Blue Lives Matter, we gotta worry about our officers and all this other stuff. And they would get mad because I would sit there and say, yes, we do have to worry about our officers. We got to worry about them murdering people. We got to worry about them being on drugs. We got to, we got to worry about them. And a lot of people would go and get bent out of shape as a consequence of this. They would go and they would get very, very angry with quite a few things, and the thing is when you go and you have people that riot and stuff, it's riots typically are the language of the unheard, So I don't think any of these riots would really be going on if cops were just, going around and behaving in a normal fashion. But I wouldn't really go and call, murdering people over a routine traffic stop when the person has no weapon, normal behavior by any means, So it's really weird, like you can't really trust cops because a lot of the time they're so twitchy. Oh Jesus fucking Christ, are they so twitchy. We've had incidences in my state where a guy in a fucking wheelchair, out of all things, was gunned down. We had a guy who literally was going and leaving the store in a power chair, and he had completely forgotten that he had the toolbox in his lap. Well, he was coming back to pay for the toolbox, and when he was coming back to pay for it, they told him to stop. The man was elderly, and so he couldn't hear them, and so they shot him to death as a consequence of this. And so everybody was outraged. Well, what happened? Nothing. Nobody was held accountable, and people are still pissed about it. You know, so I think that ACAB is a very appropriate way of going and looking at a lot of cops, well, damn near all of them these days. I have 2 friends that are cops. I try really hard not to associate with them because I just don't really trust anybody that puts on a fucking badge these days. So I feel that it's just kind of one of those things. You know, it's really just not that great. And so I feel like it's a long-term problem that we don't really have any sort of solution for, because as soon as we say, hey, what these cops are doing is wrong, there's always going to be that opposing demographic that's like, you know, these people are our heroes and like all this other stuff. The fact of the matter is every single time I go and see a cop get involved in anything, 9 times out of 10, the problem becomes substantially worse. I know that there's going to be somebody that screams, you're fucking full of shit. You're more than welcome to scream whatever it is you want. I'm just speaking from personal experience. So, if we want to go and start solving the problem, you know, let's investigate pretty much everybody that they murder, you know, and let's start holding them accountable. You know, let's literally force them to go and start cleaning up their own messes. You gotta remember that a lot of these police departments are very heavily funded. And so you kind of have to wonder, okay, you know, where's the funds for the police department going? Wrongful death suits, you know, being the biggest, things like that, you know. Them killing people without any sort of real cause, you know, and it's really awful. You know, mental stability in cops is pretty fucking low a lot of the time. If you want an example of this, I was literally coming back from an appointment last year. Apparently I had looked like somebody that they were after, and so as I was getting in my cab to go home, they had popped out of their car, pointed a gun at me, and screamed that I was under arrest. I said, what the fuck, for what? And they had mis-ID'd me. And my driver had to clear it up. This dude was wigging out so fucking hard that he could not tell the difference between somebody that is blonde versus somebody that has deep brown hair. Oh, jeez. So when you realize that you're dealing with people that aren't terribly mentally stable and stuff, you know, you just kind of don't really want them to be in any sort of position of power, more or less. It's really weird because I think society's kind of fucked up. In a lot of states, if you have heavy amounts of mental illness, you're not allowed to own like any sort of firearm, but I find that a lot of officers have huge amounts of mental illness, and yet they're allowed to walk around with a gun every day. It's really, really strange for me. But yeah, so that's pretty much what ACAB is for me, why I believe in it and stuff, and various experiences that I've had, things that I've noticed, things like that. A little bit of a shorter episode, but that's pretty much going to be a wrap and stuff. For all the people, as always, that have come out, thank you for your time and your effort and stuff. And until next time, as always, be good to yourselves and each other.